has given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth.
King Charles had faced family rebellion, public criticism, and private grief. But nothing prepared him for the command waiting inside the Privy Council's sealed ruling. Queen Camilla was to surrender Elizabeth's sacred crown immediately. No delay, no private negotiation. When Charles finished reading, he lowered the document and stared across the silent chamber. The decision threatened more than his wife's dignity. It challenged his authority and reopened a promise the palace had tried to bury. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The order left no room for mercy. The Privy Council, the senior body that formally advises the sovereign on matters of state, had directed Camilla to return the sacred piece to the protected royal collection, the official holding of historic treasures preserved for the monarchy rather than owned personally by one royal. The queen consort could no longer possess it. She could not wear it. She could not quietly appeal through her husband. Charles tightened his fingers around the final page. Elizabeth had commissioned the crown during her reign, but a confidential memorandum, a private written instruction carrying her conditions, reserved it for ceremonial use by monarchs in her direct line. Marriage did not create ownership. A consort, meaning the spouse of a reigning king or queen, could receive a temporary loan, but never claim permanent authority through it. Was there truly no other way? He asked. His voice remained controlled, yet disbelief filled the silence. Camilla did not move when the message reached her apartments. She removed her glasses, folded them carefully, and asked whether Charles had approved the ruling. The aide answered that the king had not been allowed to stop it. Humiliation hardened into fury. She had treated the crown as proof that years of judgment were finally behind her. Now its removal threatened to make every old wound public again. The final attachment made the blow even colder. Elizabeth's signed instruction declared that the crown must be reclaimed if its symbolism was ever used to strengthen a consort's independent authority. 3 senior counselors had supported immediate enforcement after receiving a documented account showing that Camilla intended to wear it at an approaching national service. Charles turned to the evidence submission and saw the name beneath it. Princess Anne had provided the record. His sister had not merely known about the challenge, she had helped set it in motion. The council's judgment was painful, but Anne's role transformed that constitutional humiliation into a family reckoning, and the next confrontation would happen behind a locked palace door before anyone could prepare for the consequences. The crown had no voice, yet it spoke differently to every person gathered around it. To Camilla, it represented acceptance after decades of judgment. To Charles, it symbolized the fragile peace he believed he had finally secured. To William, it carried the wishes of a grandmother whose authority still shaped the family. And to Anne, it was a promise that could not be rewritten simply because protecting it had become painful. Camilla's attachment had begun during preparations for a private royal commemoration honoring Elizabeth's reign. Palace officials placed the sacred piece in her care through a ceremonial loan, a temporary arrangement allowing an object to be used without transferring ownership. At first, the queen consort treated it carefully and asked permission before every movement. But slowly, its presence became personal. It seemed to prove that she was no longer merely Charles's controversial wife. She stood beside the sovereign, the reigning monarch, and the crown appeared to confirm that position. Charles understood why surrender felt unbearable to her. He remembered the years when their marriage had been treated as a scandal, and every public appearance reopened old anger. Returning the piece would not be described as a simple administrative correction. The king feared it would become proof, at least to Camilla's critics, that she remained an outsider despite years of royal service. Camilla sat before the closed presentation case and stared at its lock. "They will call this a disgrace," she told her husband. He reached for her hand, hoping the gesture might calm what words could not. She pulled away. Reassurance without action meant nothing now, and Charles felt the distance between them widen just as the family crisis deepened. William paused outside the private meeting room and quietly rehearsed one sentence. "This cannot be about revenge." The prince felt sympathy for his father, but Elizabeth's written wishes carried a different weight. His grandmother had protected the object for a reason, and he feared that ignoring her instruction would turn family loyalty into an excuse for breaking trust. Anne finally explained her concern during a recorded family conversation preserved by the palace secretary. The Princess Royal said the danger was not that Camilla wished to wear the crown once. A proposed palace description had identified it as part of the Queen Consort's permanent ceremonial collection. That wording would transform a temporary loan into an established right. Charles demanded the original inventory record. An aide then admitted through a documented account that the description had been changed only 48 hours before the council intervened. No official accepted responsibility. Someone had attempted to create ownership through language, and the missing signature on the authorization page made the alteration even more disturbing. William asked to examine that unsigned page himself. He did not yet know that its blank space pointed back to one private ceremony, and to the sentence Camilla had spoken when she believed no one important was listening. The crisis did not begin in the Privy Council chamber. It began 3 weeks earlier, after a private remembrance service at St. George's Chapel, when Camilla stood beside Elizabeth's sacred crown and made a declaration that changed everything. Only a handful of relatives heard it. One of them was Anne. What sounded like a proud remark to some felt like a direct challenge to the late Queen's command, and from that moment, silence became impossible. Elizabeth had prepared for this danger long before her death. Her confidential memorandum stated that the crown could be displayed or loaned for limited ceremonies, but it could never become part of a consort's personal collection. The memorandum was a private written order, setting firm conditions for the object's future use. It also forbade anyone from using the piece to suggest authority separate from the reigning monarch. That restriction mattered, because sacred royal objects carried meaning far beyond beauty. Possession could quietly become power. Anne carried the burden of that instruction. The Princess Royal had received a duplicate inventory and a sealed copy of her mother's order, trusting she would never need to use either against Charles's household. Yet after the remembrance service inside St. George's Chapel, a royal church at Windsor, used for worship, ceremonies, and burials, everything changed. Camilla rested her hand against the crown's case as the room emptied. "From now on, it belongs with my ceremonial pieces," she told a nearby aide. Anne stood only a few feet away. She heard every word, and the certainty in the Queen Consort's voice struck her harder than the statement itself. Anne followed her into the vestry, a private room beside the chapel, where clergy and royals could prepare away from guests. The trusted guardian demanded an explanation. Camilla insisted she had spoken practically, not politically, but her sister-in-law refused that defense. Elizabeth had chosen every restriction carefully, because she feared a temporary loan could one day be treated as permanent ownership. Charles called his sister later and asked her to let the matter rest. The king believed a treasured object was being placed above his wife's dignity. Anne heard something worse, a request to ignore their mother's final command simply because obeying it had become uncomfortable. Anne examined the palace inventory that evening and discovered the crown had already been relabeled. She photographed the altered entry and placed the image beside her duplicate memorandum. A recorded administrative conversation then confirmed that a senior household official had been instructed to change the description before the national service. The dispute was no longer about careless words. It carried evidence of deliberate action. William had already examined Elizabeth's memorandum in a documented private meeting and supported its enforcement. The prince warned Anne that silence would turn protection into surrender. She sent both records to the council but withheld his involvement from Charles. When brother, sister, wife, and heir finally entered the same room, the question was no longer who loved Elizabeth most. It was who possessed the courage to obey her. No advisors stood between them. No secretary softened the language. Charles faced Anne across a narrow table, while Camilla remained beside the sealed crown case, and William watched the family's restraint disappear. Then the king asked the question everyone had avoided. Why had his sister taken a private disagreement to the Privy Council? Her answer landed without ceremony. Because you knew our mother's wishes, and you asked me to forget them. The locked sitting room door removed every escape. Charles had requested that only 4 family members attend, hoping blood could repair what official authority had torn apart. The crown's sealed case rested nearby, turning years of tradition, resentment, and loyalty into something physically present. No one could pretend they were fighting over an idea. The object itself waited while the family divided around it. Camilla broke the silence first. She accused Anne of engineering a public humiliation while hiding behind duty. The queen consort insisted she had earned respect through years of service, only to be treated like an intruder inside her own household. The Princess Royal pushed back her chair. The humiliation began when a protected loan was described as personal property, she replied. Her words were controlled, but the anger beneath them was unmistakable. Charles rose and stepped between the 2 women. His voice sharpened as he declared that his wife had sacrificed enough to stand beside him. William answered quietly, forcing everyone to listen. The prince understood Camilla's suffering, but Elizabeth's instruction could not be changed to compensate for old cruelty. Pain did not create ownership. Sympathy could not erase a promise. Camilla reached into her handbag and removed the crown case key. She placed it on the table but kept 2 fingers pressed firmly over the metal. Anne moved her hand forward, then stopped. The trusted guardian refused to turn surrender into a physical struggle, and that restraint made the moment even more painful. The key remained trapped between possession and duty. William finally produced a dated, documented account of his private conversation with Elizabeth months before her death. His grandmother had asked him to read the memorandum and remember one warning: the crown's meaning would survive only if even the sovereign accepted its limits. A sovereign was the reigning monarch, but her message was clear. Being king did not mean every boundary could be removed. Charles stared at the account and understood the deeper truth. His mother had anticipated resistance from a future monarch. The restriction had not been written only to stop Camilla from claiming the crown. It had also been designed to stop him from protecting that claim. Anne stood and delivered the final warning. The council had appointed a custodian, an official responsible for safely collecting and protecting royal property. He would arrive before sunset. Camilla kept her fingers over the key. Yet beyond the locked room, lawful authority was already approaching, and her private resistance was about to meet an unavoidable consequence. Charles wore the crown of sovereignty, but in that chamber, sovereignty did not mean unlimited power. The Privy Council had acted through a binding custodial mechanism attached to Elizabeth's memorandum, placing the sacred peace beyond personal command. For the first time since becoming king, he confronted a boundary designed by his own mother. He could protest it, resent it, even feel wounded by it, but he could not legally make it disappear. The restriction carried more force than the royal household had understood. Elizabeth had transferred custodial authority over the sacred crown to a protected royal trust, an independent arrangement created to preserve historic objects under fixed conditions. The binding mechanism allowed the Privy Council to enforce those conditions whenever possession or classification came under dispute. Charles remained sovereign, yet the crown answered to a prior agreement rather than his personal household. Canceling the order would mean publicly challenging his mother's signed settlement. Sir Jonathan Mere entered carrying the official collection register. The senior counselor, a trusted member responsible for advising the monarch and helping enforce formal decisions, approached the table with controlled steps. Yet his hand trembled briefly as he opened the record. He told Charles that the ruling was not an attack on the king. It was the execution of Elizabeth's explicit command. Charles leaned forward and asked whether compassion had any place in their decision. Sir Jonathan did not avoid his gaze. He explained that compassion had guided the council's choice to handle the return privately. But mercy could not erase the condition protecting the object. Breaking that condition would weaken every promise attached to the royal collection. Camilla heard the exchange from the adjoining room. She stood alone beside the sealed case as anger slowly gave way to something colder. The queen consort had believed one order from her husband could end the crisis. Now she understood that Charles had no simple command capable of saving her. His crown gave him authority, but not ownership over every symbol connected to it. The register delivered another blow. Its documented entries showed that the altered inventory description had never received legal approval. No authorized signature appeared beside the new wording, and no trust official had accepted it. The attempted reclassification did not strengthen Camilla's claim. It became evidence of overreach. Sir Jonathan then disclosed through the council's recorded minutes that members had rejected a harsher option. They could have suspended her future access to several restricted royal pieces, treasures available only through special permission. Immediate cooperation would protect the queen from broader consequences. Refusal would not save the crown. It would only deepen the penalty. Charles left knowing the law had reduced everything to one choice. He had to persuade Camilla to surrender voluntarily before the council recorded an enforced seizure against her household. The crown would leave. She could decide only whether she released it with dignity or forced lawful authority to take it. At 5:06, the doors opened, and the appointed custodian entered. Camilla did not look toward him. She remained beside the case, one hand resting on its polished edge, as though touch alone could delay the inevitable. Charles watched from across the room, unable to protect her without violating the promise his mother had placed beyond him. Then the queen consort lifted her hand, turned the key, and heard the lock release. The return unfolded in complete privacy. Charles, Camilla, Anne, William, the custodian, and one registrar stood inside the sealed room. The custodian was the official appointed to take responsibility for the protected crown, while the registrar was responsible for checking and recording its condition. Their presence mattered because this was not simply a family exchange. Once the transfer began, every movement would become part of the permanent collection record. The registrar opened Elizabeth's inventory and examined the sacred piece against its written description. He checked its arches, stones, velvet lining, and engraved identification, before confirming that nothing had been removed or damaged. The crown remained intact. Yet for Camilla, that confirmation sounded less like relief, and more like the final proof that it no longer belonged near her. Camilla reached into the presentation case and lifted the piece for the last time. Her breathing caught. For one brief second, her hands appeared unwilling to move, but she steadied herself and placed the crown upon the ceremonial cushion without assistance. The custodian closed the protective case, secured its lock, and quietly confirmed that the transfer was complete. Charles moved toward his wife as soon as the words were spoken. She stopped him before he could touch her. Camilla told the king not to offer comfort until he could admit that part of him believed the council had been right. He remained silent, and that silence delivered the answer she feared. Anne felt no victory. The Princess Royal watched her sister-in-law's face fall and understood that protecting Elizabeth's wishes had inflicted a wound the family might never fully heal. William noticed the change in his aunt's expression. The prince had supported enforcement, Yet he now understood that a correct decision could still carry a cruel emotional cost. The registrar lifted the empty cushion and discovered a small card beneath it. Elizabeth's handwriting carried a single sentence: "Duty is proven most clearly when possession is surrendered." The documented note had remained hidden inside the case, waiting for the moment the crown left someone's hands. Camilla read the message twice. She did not challenge its authenticity or accuse anyone of placing it there. Instead, the Queen Consort asked the registrar for a copy. Her anger had begun to collide with an understanding she could no longer avoid. Later that night, Camilla requested a private meeting with Anne. She excluded Charles, William, counselors, and aides. The crown had been returned, but the true turning point would come when the two women faced each other without power, procedure, or the king standing between them. Camilla entered the small drawing room alone. Anne was already waiting, equally unaccompanied. There were no files on the table, and no officials outside the inner door. Only two women carrying different versions of loyalty. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then the Queen Consort placed Elizabeth's handwritten sentence between them and asked the question beneath all her anger. Did she ever believe I truly belonged here? Anne heard the pain beneath those words. This was their first conversation without Charles, counselors, or palace authorities standing between them. Camilla did not want another legal explanation. She wanted an honest answer. The Princess Royal explained that Elizabeth's restriction had been written to protect the crown, the continuing institution of monarchy, and everything held in trust for it. From personal ownership, it had never been designed to declare any family member unworthy. Camilla looked down at the handwritten card. She admitted that the sacred piece had become proof, at least in her own mind, that decades of condemnation were finally over. Every criticism, every cruel headline, and every whispered comparison had made her question whether the palace would ever truly accept her. Possessing the crown seemed to answer that fear. Losing it felt like being pushed outside the gates again. Anne did not dismiss her pain. The trusted guardian confessed that she had acted harshly because Charles had asked her to ignore their mother's memorandum. His request made Elizabeth's final instructions sound negotiable, as though affection for his wife could erase a promise made to the monarchy. The Princess Royal feared that if she remained silent once, every protected boundary would become vulnerable. Anne slid the card back across the table. Camilla did not pick it up. The silence stretched until the Queen Consort finally reached forward and read the sentence again. Her shoulders softened. "I confused being accepted with being entitled," she said, and for the first time, her words carried no anger. Anne then produced a separate private note, preserved in Elizabeth's documented archive. The late monarch had approved Camilla's future beside Charles and accepted her place as the king's wife. Her concern had never been the marriage. She feared that sacred objects could become tools of personal validation, allowing possession to replace service as proof of belonging. Camilla read that note slowly. The revelation did not erase her humiliation, but it removed the wound beneath it. Elizabeth had not rejected her. The Queen had simply refused to let affection weaken the rules surrounding the crown. Camilla agreed to issue a formal statement affirming the sacred piece's protected status. She also withdrew her request to wear it at the national service, ending the immediate challenge without another forced order. Anne warned her that the public already knew a transfer had occurred. The next words spoken outside that room would decide whether the surrender became a scandal or an act of humility. Their private peace could not silence the shock beyond the palace walls, but it gave Camilla something stronger than possession: the power to define how she had surrendered it. By morning, the private return had become the only story Britain wanted to discuss. Yet it was not a leaked document that captured the nation. It was one photograph outside the Jewel House, a dark royal vehicle arriving beneath gray skies as the sealed crown case was carried through the gates. Behind the barriers, the crowd fell unexpectedly quiet. In that silence, the struggle inside the palace became a national judgment about inheritance, duty, and restraint. Palace officials moved quickly to control the story. Their formal statement confirmed that Elizabeth's sacred crown had been restored to protected custody in accordance with her written instructions. The Jewel House was the secure home where many of the monarchy's most important ceremonial treasures were guarded and displayed. Officials assigned no blame. Instead, they emphasized continuity, insisting that the return protected a promise across generations rather than punishing one individual. Broadcasters gave the moment a far sharper meaning. Evening reports described it as a rare example of a late sovereign's wishes placing a visible limit on the reigning household. Elizabeth was gone, yet her signed command had restrained the preferences of those who came after her. That mattered, because the monarchy depended on continuity. If one household could erase an earlier promise, every future royal instruction would become vulnerable. The crowd outside the gates provided the image Britain remembered. Spectators watched the custodian carry the sealed case into protected custody. One woman slowly lowered a small Union flag and said, "It is back where she wanted it." Broadcasters captured the remark in recorded street coverage, and the sentence was repeated across evening reports. A newspaper turned the surrender into a national argument. Its front page showed the closed case beneath 3 words, "Her final command." Some readers praised the defense of Elizabeth's wishes. Others saw only Camilla's humiliation and questioned whether obedience required such a painful public spectacle. Charles watched the coverage alone until William entered. The king admitted that seeing the surrender discussed like entertainment made him feel he had failed both his wife and his mother. He could not protect Camilla without defying Elizabeth. Yet respecting the late queen had exposed the woman beside him to public judgment. The prince listened before reminding his father that silence would allow others to define the entire crisis. Camilla answered through a documented palace statement released in her own name. The queen consort acknowledged the crown's protected status, accepted the council's decision, and declared that royal service did not depend on possessing sacred treasures. No accusation appeared. No excuse weakened the message. Public opinion shifted. Broadcasters increasingly described the return not as her defeat, but as a difficult act of obedience that preserved Elizabeth's boundary. Humiliation had begun turning into humility. Charles understood that one final decision remained. He prepared a family declaration that would settle the crown's future and define what the crisis had taught his reign. The nation had delivered its judgment. Now the monarch had to deliver the verdict that would decide whether his family remembered this as humiliation or the restoration of trust. Charles entered the final meeting carrying no legal papers and offering no argument. The sacred crown was already beyond reach. Camilla had accepted the ruling, and Elizabeth's command had been fulfilled. What remained was the deeper wound: a husband who felt powerless, a wife who had mistaken possession for belonging, a sister forced to defend their mother, and an heir caught between them. The king could not reverse what had happened, but he could decide what it would mean. Charles gathered Camilla, Anne, and William around the same table, where their anger had once overwhelmed restraint. He confirmed that the sacred peace would remain permanently within protected custody. No consort, the husband or wife of a reigning monarch, would ever absorb it into a personal ceremonial collection. The decision closed the argument completely. What Elizabeth had protected in writing would remain protected after every person in that room was gone. The king ordered the palace inventory corrected and introduced a formal review process for restricted royal objects. The inventory was the official record identifying each treasure, its owner, and the rules controlling its use. From that moment, no household could quietly change a classification without written approval from the royal trust. The failure that created the crisis would not be allowed to happen again. Charles turned to his wife and told her that returning the crown had not diminished her place beside him. Camilla answered without hesitation, Keeping it, she said, would have diminished the institution she had hoped it would help her represent. The queen consort finally understood that belonging could not be proved by possessing something sacred. Charles then thanked Anne for defending their mother's wishes, even though her actions had wounded him. The Princess Royal accepted his words without celebration. She regretted the pain, but not the decision. Elizabeth had trusted her to protect a boundary, and family affection could not erase that charge. William placed the corrected inventory before his father. The prince watched as Charles signed the final entry, paused, and passed the pen to Camilla. She added her signature as a witness. That single act made her acceptance deliberate, public, and permanent. The official archive received Elizabeth's handwritten card beside the original memorandum. The archive, a protected collection of historic royal records, would preserve its message for those who came later. Duty was proven most clearly through surrender. Because Camilla had cooperated voluntarily, the threatened restrictions on her access to other ceremonial jewels were withdrawn. No further punishment followed. The crisis ended without a victor or a defeated enemy. Charles regained trust by respecting the limit placed before him. Anne fulfilled her mother's final charge. William protected continuity for the future, while Camilla discovered that service, not possession, proved where she belonged. Elizabeth's sacred crown returned to its protected place. The family reconciled, and the monarchy emerged with a painful but lasting truth. Inheritance carried limits. Marriage could not override solemn promises, and royal authority became stronger when it submitted to duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.